Have you ever wondered how the medicines you take are tested? Experiment cell models play a crucial role in the development of biomedical technologies, including drugs and vaccines. What if I told you that it's possible to obtain cells from your menstrual blood that meet the main requirements for using these models? Menstrual blood mesenchymal cells are abundant, easy to obtain, super resistant, and quick to grow, but they are hardly used. Even though there are many menstruating bodies and humans who don't menstruate, these cells are perceived as feminine. And that is a reason why it's said that menstrual blood cells can't be used as a model for research. At the same time, most of the drugs you see in the box at the pharmacy and in the hospital have only been tested on male cells. Scientists say that's okay, because everything that works on a male model will also work on our diverse bodies. If any human cell could become a model, a female cell could be used, could it not? The choice of which cells will be used in research is a very important part of science, but the choice scientists make in model selection are not always based on scientific reasons. Why does this happen? How have the models used in research been chosen? And does the sex of the cell really make no difference? In this podcast series, I, Fernanda Mariath, will take you from the inside to the outside of a cell. And starting with the organelles, the tiny little part inside them, I'm going to tell you about menstrual blood cells and bring you feminist discussions in stem cell research. Let's go! I'm Fernanda Mariath, a pharmacist with a master's degree in Scientific and Culture Dissemination. Also, I'm part of the Mundaréu Podcast, which focuses on telling stories about feminist Latin America researchers. As part of my dissertation, I produced the series Feminista In Vitro. This series is already available in Portuguese on Mundaréu's website, with a transcription in PDF. But as part of this journey, I also did some interviews in English with Professor Sarah Richardson, the PhD student Hannah Cowdell, and the Professor Malin-Ah King. This episode is an audio-colagem of these interviews. I hope you enjoy!
So I'm Sarah Richardson. I'm a historian and philosopher of science and a gender studies scholar. I'm a professor at Harvard University, and I direct the Harvard Gender Sci Lab, which is an interdisciplinary collaborative community of feminist scholars who think critically and searchingly about the sciences of sex, gender, sexuality, and reproduction. So in the Gender Sci Lab is not a laboratory with pipettes and with white coats and big machines. We are a collaborative of researchers across the fields, from public health to genetics to bioanthropology to sociology, philosophy, and history of science. We come together because sex is not just a biological category. It requires all of these areas of expertise to understand its dynamics and its situatedness. And then the relationship between science, which also is complex, and gender systems requires a whole lot of different sophisticated ways of understanding knowledge systems, their histories, and their functioning. So the lab is something that I created to hopefully generate scholarship that bridges areas that are often not touching each other, that creates knowledge that is transdisciplinary and asks questions that are often not asked because people don't have the tools to do it alone. I also wanted to train a new generation of feminist scientists, and we do that by doing research together. So it's developed into an amazing training space for young scholars who are interested in developing interdisciplinary skills in the study of the intersection between gender and science. And we publish in medical and scientific journals as well as in social science and humanities journals. And we build collaborative interdisciplinary teams around difficult topics. Well, sex is one category through which we might capture variation. It is the case that in sexual species, sex determination is an important developmental pathway that can lead to different developmental programs unraveling on different timescales. And so, depending on the research, it may be valuable and important to track a sex category and variation across and within the sexes. There can be biomedically important differences in those pathways. And so just like age, just like ecological context, there are all sorts of variables that standardly are considered when looking at variation in a particular sample. So sex is a valid category for capturing that kind of diversity, but in many cases, it may be too crude to capture the kind of variation that the researcher is actually interested in. I think we need to build a conversation around being more precise about the mechanisms and variables that are of interest when we're tracking sex-related variation, rather than simply using sex category, say male or female, men or women, as a crude proxy for that variation. The short answer is that sex contextualism holds that what sex is and whether it is relevant to a particular research question depends on the context. The context could include the species being used, the level of biological analysis, the pragmatics of the technologies and tools being used, or the sample that is being studied, or an artifact of the arrangements needed to model a phenomenon in the laboratory. Sex contextualism can be contrasted with sex essentialism, which is the view that every bit of biological material from the whole organism down to its cells or organelles has a sex, a binary sex, either a male or a female, simply because of its provenance from a sexed body. Sex essentialism structures most biological research and biomedical research that touches on the question of variation across and among the sexes and genders. I offer sex contextualism as an alternative way of conceptualizing and interpreting findings about sex-related variation to the implicit default sex essentialism that structures so much scientific research. And certainly, sex contextualism embraces the idea that sometimes what we might call binary sex is appropriate to the question, but to your question of what could the harms be. So when we work in binary sex essentialist way in biomedicine, there could be scientific harms, that is misidentifying the precise mechanisms, pathways, variables, and factors that are creating an apparent difference between the male sex category and the female sex category. These could be hormonal variants, environmental factors, body size, and other features of body, biology, and environment that vary across contexts and across groups. one might also over-homogenize what males are like and what females are like, missing a great deal of variation within each of those categories. So the harms for science is that you introduce an a priori assumption that these are the right categories. And so you create distortions in the way that you design the research and then interpret the findings. But there are harms beyond that as well. And this includes reinforcing essentialist ideas about men and women, boys and girls, males and females. So when we work in binary sex essentialist way in biomedicine, we may unwittingly contribute to a long history of sourcing the physiological, the biological, the hormonal, the body as the site, the causal site of the gender and sex disparities or inequalities that we see in the world. And that would be an error as well. There have been massive changes in gender systems and in the embodiment of maleness and femaleness over time that help us know that gender and sex have plasticity and context specificity. So we could end up enforcing binary ways of understanding that contribute to stigma, stereotyping, and inequality, not just for cisgendered men and women, but also for gender minorities, including people who identify outside of the binary or are born outside of the binary. So to create an inclusive science and to counter the use of biology to reinforce gender stereotypes, it's very important for biomedical researchers to be aware of how they need to build an understanding of their scientific findings that doesn't travel into the world and unwittingly create those social harms. So as an example of sex contextualism in practice, so let me just say that sex contextualism is both a descriptive theory and a normative theory, meaning that sex contextualism describes what scientists do. They may believe that they are sex essentialists and that they are looking at binary factors. But actually, when you look at it, they're looking at an operationalization of sex in a particular frame. So I think in stem cells, sex probably doesn't matter at many, many different levels of analysis and in many circumstances. And then some sort of sex-related variable might matter in a very artifactual way for the particular processes and technologies through which we make stem cells work for us in the laboratory. So I think sex contextualism happens almost any time someone is looking at sex-related variables. Then there's the normative idea of what sex contextualism asks you to do, which is to be very, very precise about the contexts that are informing the construct of sex that is being produced through a particular material arrangement in the laboratory, and to spell out how one is operationalizing sex. Are you looking at the genitals, or are you looking at cells where you would just look at their chromosomal signature? Or are we looking at a whole mix, an array of factors, not only the chromosomes, but also perhaps the gender and sex-related variables that are in a cell medium, for example? So all of that specificity can help us understand the generalizability of any finding about what females are like or what males are like. And I think would be ameliorative. It would improve practices to have greater reflexivity about how sex is, in fact, being operationalized, arranged, and understood in a laboratory, which, of course, is always a model system. It's a limited, idealized way of understanding a bigger problem in the world. It's simplified, in short. Ambien is, of course, a popular sleep drug that became, some years ago, a hallmark example used to argue for the need for studies of sex differences in the development of drugs, particularly in the preclinical process of drug testing. Why? Because it was observed that a larger number of women compared to men were having adverse drug events, specifically perhaps being drowsier after taking the drug the next day. When the Food and Drug Administration in the United States examined the situation, they noticed that it appeared that women cleared the drug more slowly from their systems. So, for the first time in history, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration issued a dosage guidance for the drug Ambien, also known as zolpidem, that halved the dose for women compared to men. And for advocates of sex difference biology, this looked like it could be the tip of the iceberg. Perhaps all drugs should have sex-specific dosing, they suggested. Look at this history of not examining sex differences. Imagine the harms that could occur. Now, the story that I and my colleagues at the Gender Sci Lab tell is the unraveling of that narrative in the subsequent years. So, as it turns out, there's no relationship between clearance of the drug zolpidem from the system and adverse events. There's no clear evidence, actually, of sex differences in adverse events in zolpidem. And the reasoning behind this half dosage had more to do with the petition by a pharmaceutical company to somehow get a failing drug through FDA approval in the United States. We argue that just assembling evidence in pharmaceutical research on the pharmacokinetics and dynamics of the drug, we argue that the sex difference in drug clearance is, in any case, rendered non-statistically significant when body size or body weight is taken into account, meaning that the dosage recommendation in the United States will underdose some men, or rather overdose some men and underdose many women. In fact, no other country has followed the US in this sex-specific dosing for these reasons. So it actually ends up being a tale about the complexities of sex, and that you really need to look for the source of the variation. And in this case, sex differences were overdone with potential harms. So actually, the case of Ambien is now being taught in medical schools, not to show the importance of sex differences, but to show instead the follies of reasoning that can happen when one thinks in a two-binary way about sex, which is a really lovely turnabout. And I'm glad that this case study exists to help people nuance and refine their thinking. Because after all, it certainly is alarming, the idea that medical research hasn't been done on women, or that there could be a class of drugs out there that is performing more poorly for women compared to men. And there certainly is a history of androcentrism in medicine. But the flip side is not often considered as much, which is the harms that we can do when we overemphasize a crude category. Well, I agree that it's difficult, partly because the way that we have developed our biomedical research ecosystem is to focus on biomedical or biological pathways, mechanisms, and so on. And so to properly study the sexed body, one needs to study it in its full embodied social context. You need a biosocial science. You need biosocial scientists, meaning that you need people who have training in the culturally and geographically specific performance of gendered embodiment at both the relational and individual level as well as the structural level, and people who understand bodies and their reactivity to these environments to fully parse patterns of variation across men and women. and people of diverse genders and sexualities. So that's my passion in the Gender Sci Lab. We have to build people who have that flexibility of mind and actual rigorous training across these fields. People who can read widely, who can bridge across fields, and who can test and generate diverse hypotheses, social, biological, and the combination of the two to understand the patterns that we see. So that's my hope, that we will move away from the rigid biological essentialism that has structured much of the recent interest in women's health, for example, and toward this hybrid methodology and truly transdisciplinary field. I think that's exciting. And we need a sex and gender science that invites in many forms of expertise, that acknowledges uncertainties, that is interested in variation and context, and that is accountable and ethical when it comes to making claims that can travel beyond the laboratory door to taken up irresponsibly in the political and cultural realm.
I'm Hannah. I'm a PhD student at the University of Exeter in the UK, and this is my second year of PhD research. I'm a PhD student at the University of Exeter, which is in sort of the southwest of the UK. It's quite a small university town, and I've been there for 2 years. Before that, I was at the University of Oxford doing a master's in Middle East studies. So that's my kind of disciplinary background. I come from an area studies kind of perspective. And I did my undergrad at the University of Oxford as well. I was born in London, in the kind of South London in Greenwich, but I grew up a bit south of London in a sort of smallish town. So I work on basically like ontologies of sex and gender in Lebanon, broadly speaking, and like looking at particular sort of contexts of citizenship in which they come together or diverge. So gender recognition cases is one of these contexts, but also I'm looking at sort of more carceral contexts, like gender non-conforming behavior is criminalized in some way. So like cross-dressing, for example, or homosexuality. These are often, like homosexuality is often considered in the context of gender in Lebanon. Like the two, gender non-conformity and homosexuality are often conflated, particularly in these kind of like judicial contexts. My PhD project kind of came into being because I was interested in a number of gender recognition cases that had happened in the kind of like mid-2010s. My background, as I said, is in Middle East studies. I learned Arabic when I was an undergrad, and I kind of like, through pursuing Arabic, I became interested in the kind of broader socio-political context of the Middle East and Lebanon in particular. And yeah, Lebanon had these series of gender recognition cases in the 2010s where the basically judges or magistrates in these cases had been making rulings which challenged some of the kind of conventions in previous gender recognition cases around kind of like what would be sufficient levels of kind of like bodily changes in transgender patients to justify reclassifying their gender in straight state records. Like previously there'd been like a very high kind of standard, I guess you might call it, for what kind of operations you needed to have for the state to be able to consider that it could be reclassified as a new gender. And this normally involved kind of sterilization and what might be described as like full gender affirmation surgeries, although obviously that's like questionable way of putting it. But like these cases in the 2010s began to justify that like they began to rule that patients had a right to privacy, and that like part of that was ruling that their gender could be changed before they'd had some surgeries because the patients were already experiencing these kind of conflicts and encounters with state officials where their kind of the way they presented visually didn't match their gender, recorded gender on state documents. So I was interested in these cases and specifically the shift and like what had led to that shift in rulings when previously there had been these very strict restrictions on what kind of like medical procedures you would have had to have your gender reclassified. But since I've started the project, it's broadened out to look more generally at kind of medical authority and sex and gender and how that is operationalized in legal contexts. The presentation was basically about a small aspect of my research that I've been engaging with recently. So basically, like, one of the things I've been trying to do with my research is find out more historically about how doctors in Lebanon sort of had authority over determining kind of the boundaries of gender categories and sex categories. And one of the ways I wanted to do this was by looking at sort of history of medical encounters with people with variations in sex characteristics. And what I found was that actually there had been a lot of research, medical research in Lebanon on intersex conditions, basically, from the kind of like mid-1960s until the mid-1980s. There's still research going on now, but there was like a particular kind of density of case studies that were done in this period, which was connected to a kind of interest in the genetics of sex development in Lebanon. And a lot of these Lebanese doctors had done training at Johns Hopkins University and published papers with doctors at Johns Hopkins like Howard W. Jones, who were very involved with the gender identity clinic that was present at Hopkins at that time. And I was looking at these case studies, and they're really interesting sources because in some ways they're very personal. You know, like people tell their life histories to doctors, particularly in cases where their gender identity doesn't match the sex that they're assigned at birth. But I was interested in the fact that although they are very personal, like a lot of that personalness in the paper gets taken out because the conventions of how medical case studies are written, obviously for good reasons, they're anonymized, but also like they're made to conform to a particular kind of genre of medical writing that's very standardized. And part of that is the removal of the doctor from the context of the paper. And you're just left with this kind of like sort of God's eye view perspective of the patient and their body and their experiences, like this sort of sense of omniscience. And there's also like no context in the paper about the sort of like historical moment in which the patients were seen. And what's interesting about these papers is that they take place, well, most of the research took place during the Lebanese Civil War and at the American University of Beirut Medical Center, which was like one of the major emergency care centers during the conflict, and like often at particular kind of flashpoints in the conflict, one of the only functioning hospitals. So I was kind of interested in those absences in the texts and how we might kind of like queer the medical conventions of the case to try and like bring some of this context back in. So that's kind of what my presentation was about, and like also looking kind of at how this medical research more broadly into variations in sex characteristics was tied to sort of nationalist projects at the time around like sort of cataloguing genetic difference in Lebanon, which is something like I want to look into further in my research because there's very little information about this national genetic kind of cataloguing project that was going on in the 1970s and 80s at this moment in the Civil War, and a lot of funding was being directed to it, but I'm not really sure at this point how it came into being. So that was part of it. And then also I was talking a bit about how, because of the Civil War context, a lot of the research was confined to Beirut, which has always been in Lebanon the kind of like where the densest concentration of doctors and medical care have been. Lebanon's a very small country. You can drive the entire length of the country maybe 2.5, 3 hours. But during the Civil War, like the south of Lebanon became disconnected from the rest of the country because of Israeli occupation. So that was also something I was trying to bring into the reading of the papers and looking at an Israeli medical case study that happened simultaneously during this period of time. The chapter I've been writing at the moment is like looking at this period of time from the mid-60s to sort of like 80s and 90s, because this is like the period in which a lot of new-ish medical technologies for the kind of management of sex characteristics in some way became available in Lebanon. So for example, like the use of sex hormones to kind of like alter people's sort of hormonal balances in ways that change their secondary sexual characteristics, either in cisgender patients or transgender patients or patients with variations in sex characteristics. But also like genetic testing for sort of chromosomal differences and chromosomal sex. This was something that like started being used more regularly from the 1970s in Lebanon. And then I'm also looking at changes in surgical techniques. So this is the period that I'm particularly sort of focusing on at the moment, because it's a fundamental shift in the way that doctors approach sex. But what's interesting, some of the cases I'm looking at, the doctors have this sort of split kind of perspective when it comes to sex and gender. So on the one hand, they have this medical understanding of this sort of like layered concept of sex, where you have like hormonal sex, chromosomal sex, anatomical sex, and they sort of treat these very kind of like quote unquote objectively in their papers with nuance, and they're also like interested in sort of pushing the boundaries of research in these things. So there are a number of gynecologists from Lebanon who are involved in this medical research looking at chromosomal differences in sex, conditions like congenital absence of the vagina and things like that, and how like analyzing someone's chromosomal sex might affect how you approach the treatment of that condition. But at the same time, like there are a number of like autobiographies of doctors working in Lebanon from this time where they mention encountering patients with variations in sex characteristics. And although they do these tests, that kind of like are meant to kind of like medically determine what this person's sex is and justify treatment. So, for example, there's like one case from a village in South Lebanon where a doctor encountered a patient who had been raised as female but identified as male and wanted surgery to basically like give a more masculine body. And the doctor like does these tests and like finds out that the patient has XY chromosomes and that they have like, like levels of testosterone that are more comparable to, well, they fall within the boundaries of what is considered male, right? So this kind of provides the justification for like the doctor then doing the surgeries that the patient wants. But at the same time, like the doctor sort of talks about his own perception of the patient, and like he does this thing where like he first refers to the patient as a woman and then as a man, but like he sort of like describes the patient as, like a very attractive woman and like with sort of very glossy hair, which gets like taken by the nurses to make wigs after the patient decides to cut it. And so like although the doctors have this like quote unquote scientific view of sex as something that's like complex and multi-layered and not necessarily obvious, like their reactions to the patients are still very gendered, right? Like based on their kind of ideas about what masculinity and femininity, how they should be embodied or how they are embodied. And gender and the sort of like what might be considered the typical embodiment of sex associated with gender, like definitely plays into like how the doctors I'm looking at like perceive the boundaries of male and female sex categories. So for example, like a lot of the hormonal management that they describe in their patients is to do with like ensuring that the patients like embody sex in a way that doesn't trouble their gender. So like they talk about cisgender female patients, for example, who have like what they describe as excessive hair growth. But I mean, obviously, how do you determine what is excessive hair growth in terms of masculinity and femininity? There's like a huge scale, but like there's a gendered expectation in Lebanon, as there is in many places, that women are like more hairless than men and things like that. So that's kind of one aspect that plays into it. But like another thing that I should mention that we can open up a broader discussion about is that during this period of time, the 60s to the 80s in Lebanon, the sort of like doctrine of gender neutrality that was developed by John Money and John Hopkins, it was kind of like the way that they would approach genital ambiguity in patients. So like if a child was born with what they would describe as a sort of inadequately sized penis, they would be more likely to assign the child as female. So there was the sense that like gender was somehow disentangled from sex, or that there wasn't a biological basis for gender, and that therefore like you could assign a child as male or female based on what would maybe be like surgically easiest to achieve if you were kind of altering the genitals of the child in some way. So that's definitely like part of the context at the time, this kind of like idea that came from sort of more psychiatric context and was being like very practically applied by doctors, although this is like is shifting. It's still like I read a case study recently. There's some like testimonies from intersex individuals from Lebanon who had like these kind of experiences where doctors had made like practical decisions about what was easiest for them in terms of sex assignment that didn't correspond with patients' kind of gender identities later in life. it's something that's like I'm still beginning to work with in my research. But I think, at least from what I've been doing so far, like it's about kind of like challenging conventions and like structures around the production of medical knowledge, like making things that are very normalized into something that's sort of somewhat strange, and trying to kind of, like read the sort of the subtext of these things and foreground that and in that way kind of trouble how we think conventionally about medical research, for example. And also like in terms of sort of research methodologies, like I think it's also a sense of thinking about, like how academia more generally is kind of implicated in replicating some of these structural injustices and thinking about how we can also sort of queer the research process through working differently, I guess. So one of the things that I'm hoping to do eventually with my research is like bring some of the historical research that I've done back to sort of individuals who might have more personal connection to these histories and sort of do workshops with them around that. I think it's like sort of the critical nature of queer theory is, I think, something that is beneficial basically within biomedical research, because like we were talking about earlier, like things like socioculturally dominant ideas about gender become embedded within medical research. So I think that like, a lot of the insights from queer theory about like how these things are constructed and how we can trouble them are important because they have a very material impact on how biomedicine operates. Like you were talking about your research with stem cells, like a potentially useful source of stem cells is being avoided because of these gendered assumptions that queer theory would trouble. So. Well, I guess because of this, very normative aspect of biomedicine that we will encounter in our lives, because most of us, if we have any issues with our health, are going to engage with this kind of like Western biomedical discipline in a personal perspective. And those of us with various identities or embodied experiences that differ from these kind of like sociocultural norms are going to encounter some kind of tension in these medical contexts because of the way that those assumptions are woven into medicine itself. Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, like, queer theory is maybe closer to biomedicine than biomedicine is to queer theory because of the way that, like, examples from the history of biomedicine are used to make arguments, like, that use queer theory. So, for example, like David Griffiths was saying earlier in the conference, like, intersex people's bodies and their experiences with medicine have often been used, like, to theorize sex within academia to kind of like trouble the assumptions of like sexual dimorphism. There is some will amongst medical professionals now to kind of like question some of the dominant narratives or dominant norms within medicine in order to provide better care for patients. It's more inclusive. But I mean, I think there is like within medicine that adopting a queer perspective can bring you new insights, like new ways of working, new treatment protocols, new kind of like ways of approaching natural phenomena. But I think that there's still some resistance probably to kind of like adopting that, given how entrenched kind of like the discipline of medicine is and its ways of working.
My name is Malin-Ah King. I was trained as a biologist, and then I did my doctoral studies in biology. And after that, I have steered towards working on interdisciplinary research on gender and biology. For example, I have questioned the notions of biological sex as binary and stable, and showed the variability and effects and sex determination among animals, for example. And there are lots of animals that sex change, for example. And then I've also worked on scrutinizing gender stereotypes and heteronormative conceptions in theory and research in biology, as well as in biology textbook. I have also written a book about how perceptions about females have changed in evolutionary biology, from how Darwin described them as females as passive and coy, towards how the researchers nowadays acknowledge that females do have active sexual strategies. Well, since my work is trying to understand gender stereotypes and what the gender controversies are within research, it's a way of trying to make science better. It's a way of trying to put light on perspectives that are perhaps ignored or forgotten, and trying to make visible how these gender stereotypes or how gender bias is part of our science, and how we can make science better through acknowledging that and trying to make science better. So I would say, with the example of how science had these perceptions about females as being passive, then most of the research was done on the males and trying to understand their active strategies. And by doing that and having these perceptions of passive females, we were ignoring what females were doing in all their strategies. So by making us aware of this gender bias, we can actually get a fuller picture of what is happening out there. And I would say that is also better for the people, because what science is doing is also, and especially when it comes to questions about sex differences, and what science says about sex differences is also influences society and our perceptions about humans and ourselves. My current research project concerns a controversy among evolutionary biologists over what sex differences are and how we can explain. So I'm trying to understand how this controversy has emerged and what the researchers are disagreeing about, what the key points of disagreements are, and what is at stake in this debate. Well, so now we're talking about evolutionary biologists. They work with a theory of how sex differences have evolved. So I have identified what the researchers are disagreeing about. So one source of disagreement among these evolutionary biologists is how big is the role of the size of the sex differences in eggs and sperm, how much the females and males are investing in their sex cells for further sex differences, how they behave, if they are competing among each other or if they are choosy in mate choice, for example. Another one is a debate over recent gender-neutral models. So whether there has been a presentation of alternative models to these prevailing assumptions that the size of the sex cells are very important for how females and males behave. And this new gender-neutral model says that individuals, independent of what sex they have, should choose mate choice and be choosy and be indiscriminate depending on environmental circumstances. So it's a model that starts out with an idea of sex having very dynamic sex differences in how they choose. So, and then this model has been criticized. One point of disagreement is the validity of these recent gender-neutral models. And a third point of disagreement is the validity of the prevailing paradigm. So should we think that the prevailing paradigm is valid, or should we, there has been a lot of feminist critique towards this prevailing paradigm, including this assumption that sex differences in size of the sex cells is very important. So there has been a lot of critique and calls for re-evaluating this paradigm. I think it's very interesting. Nowadays, we have learned so much about variability in sex and in sex differences and in how, as I said, animals can often choose sex, or in many animals change sex. So I think now that we have gotten to know much more about the variability, it's interesting how the researchers themselves, they interpret this variability in different ways, either as there are these general trends that males compete among each other and females often take care of the offspring. And then there are all these exceptions. And on the other hand, other researchers interpret this as, well, sex differences are dynamic, and sometimes those two understandings clash. So I think this is a very interesting field. I'm interested in understanding what the different perspectives are and why they come to different conclusions. So I do have a feminist starting point. I think feminist critique of the natural sciences and how knowledge is produced is kind of at the core of what I'm trying to understand. So in this case, in this controversy, the feminist critique was the beginning of the controversy. It started out the controversy, and it has run through the process of the controversy. So for me, it's interesting to understand the role of feminist critique in the development of science. In the book I wrote about how perceptions about females have shifted, the feminist biologists have been really important in pushing both the criticism of gender bias within the field, these assumptions, taken for granted assumptions about females being passive. And then they have criticized that, and they have changed how science work and how science, the basic assumptions about how females are. So this critique has been very, very important within the field. Although I also show that it's not only the feminist critique which shifted the perceptions about females towards viewing females as active. Sometimes it's a researcher who's working on a specific animal and just realizes, well, it doesn't fit with our theories. It's in this species, females are really active in disrupting a mating or something like that. One example is in bird research. There has been this idea that most birds live in pair bonds, and in pair formations, they bring up their offspring together. So then the females were assumed to mate with only the male, the social mate. And this was a general assumption until there was a new technology, the DNA fingerprinting, which we also use as parental analysis. So they started using that for birds as well in the end of the 1980s. And so in the 1990s, there came out a lot of studies showing that, females actually mate with several males. In most species, even when they bring up certain offspring together with a male, female would mate with other males as well. Sometimes just one or two, but sometimes many. So there was a shift in our understanding of what females were doing. But at the start of this change in understanding of female multiple mating, the general understanding or the general explanation for this was that, it's the males who impose themselves onto the females. They coerce them. It's not a female strategy, it's a male strategy onto the females. Until there were feminist researchers who were criticizing this assumption and made investigations to try to understand. They put radio trackers onto the females and they followed the females in the field, and they saw that, females don't only mate with males who are coming into their territory, but instead they're seeking out territories of males with higher rank than their social mate. So the results showed that the females were initiating these matings. So this was an active female strategy. My analysis of the field is kind of an outsider perspective, but there are also feminists working within the field. And there has been, when I wrote about the history of shifting perceptions, I encountered several examples where feminist perspectives have been criticized in the field, and that they have met resistance. And there's always this dilemma. So many people see feminist perspectives as something political, which is outside of science. So that is one kind of resistance, that this, a feminist perspective doesn't have anything to do with science, because science is value neutral and objective. But then historians of science have shown who is doing the science, and our male-dominated science often forms perceptions about males and females and how that is brought into the science. So science history have shown that who is doing the science actually has something to do with what kind of knowledge we gain from science. So this feminist perspective is also part of the critique of this value neutrality and objectivity in science. And sometimes there is resistance towards that, and sometimes it's also well known among scientists. So the scientists themselves talk about how their perspective is formed by the kind of theoretical tradition they're working in, and how somebody else's perspective is formed by the kind of animals they're working with. So they also understand how, what we call in feminist science studies, knowledge is situated by the researcher and lived experiences of the researchers, and the kind of context, the historical context of those persons doing the science. So I've encountered 3 types of reactions towards my work, feminist perspectives on science, and that is, some scientists are just not interested or open to that kind of perspectives, so they're not communicating or not interested. And then there are a few feminist biologists who are very interested and very engaged in these kind of perspectives themselves. And then I think the large majority of biologists are kind of interested and perhaps a bit skeptical, but interested in what a gender perspective on science could be. So this is the big potential for communicating these perspectives to scientists, the biggest potential of changing people's views.
Thank you so much for listening. See you in the future.